The wind came for Taza Redhawk that night. It screamed across the Wyoming plains like a banshee, driving a wall of snow so thick it erased the world. February of 1887 was a cruel month on a cruel frontier, and this blizzard was its masterpiece. Taza pulled the thick buffalo coat tighter around his 7-foot frame, the lantern in his hand swinging wild, throwing dancing monsters against the swirling white. The folks down in Cedar Ridge, 15 miles of bad road to the east, had plenty of names for him. The giant Apache, they'd whisper. Half savage, they'd mutter. He was the reason mothers pulled their children close, the shadow that haunted the edge of their small, frightened world. He'd built his homestead far from their whispers, out where the land was empty and honest. His father was Apache, his mother a freed slave. The combination made him a ghost in his own land, too dark for the whites, too different for the tribes. He was a man so large that no one ever bothered to look for the soul inside. He reached the barn, the wind fighting him like a living thing. The door was frozen shut, sealed with ice. Taza set his jaw, gripped the handle, and pulled. Muscles bunched like coiled ropes beneath his coat, and with a groan of tortured wood, the door gave way. Inside, the air was still and cold. His 2 horses nickered a soft welcome, their breath pluming like smoke in the lantern light. He hung the lantern on its peg and moved to their water trough, shattering the skin of ice with a single, powerful fist. And that's when he heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the horses. It was a sound that did not belong. A soft sound. A human sound. Taza froze. Every nerve honed by 20 years of solitude went on high alert. His hand moved without thought, resting on the hilt of the big knife at his belt. No one, in all his years here, had ever come to his land uninvited. Not like this. He lifted the lantern high, painting the barn in stark relief. Shadows leaped and danced across the stalls. There, in the far corner, in the deep pile of hay he kept for winter emergencies. Something moved, just a flicker of dark fabric against the gold of the straw. He moved slow, his boots making no sound on the packed earth floor. The air grew thick, heavy with a tension he could taste. He held the lantern out, peering into the shadows. What he saw made the breath catch in his throat. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a threat he could fight with a knife or a fist. Curled in the hay, small and broken like a wounded fawn, was a woman. Her body was drawn tight, a protective circle around the unmistakable swell of a belly. She was with child, very much with child. Her dress, what might have once been fine blue wool, was torn and caked with mud and ice. Frost glittered in her dark hair like a cruel crown. But it was her face that held him captive. Delicate high cheekbones, a straight nose, lips blue with a cold so deep it was starting to claim her. Her skin had that waxy, translucent look he'd seen on men who'd frozen to death on the plains. He knelt beside her, his huge frame casting a shadow over her small one. His hands, calloused and scarred from a life of hard labor, moved with a gentleness that would have shocked the people of Cedar Ridge. He touched her shoulder. It was as cold as a river stone. "Ma'am?" he whispered. No response. He leaned closer, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He watched her lips, praying for a sign. And then he saw it, a tiny faint puff of white. She was breathing, alive, but only just. How in God's name had she gotten here? How had she found his barn in the middle of a killer blizzard, 15 miles from anywhere? His eyes scanned the small space around her, a wedding ring, loose on a finger, made thin by hunger. A small, elegant carpet bag with the initials EM stitched in fine thread. This was no drifter. This was a woman who had fallen from a great height. Another gust of wind slammed against the barn, shaking the very timbers. The woman shivered, a violent, bone-deep tremor that seemed to rack her entire body. There was no choice. Not for a man like Taza. He shrugged off his priceless buffalo coat, the one thing that stood between him and the killing cold, and wrapped it around her. Then, as gently as he could, he slid his arms beneath her and lifted. She weighed almost nothing. A bundle of bird bones and baby, light as a whisper. Her head lolled against his chest as he carried her out into the screaming storm. The journey back to the cabin was a fight for every step. The snow was past his knees, and he had to turn his own body into a shield to protect her face from the driving ice. By the time he kicked his cabin door open, his shirt was frozen solid, and his arms burned with a fire that had nothing to do with the cold. The cabin was one room, simple but warm, a stone fireplace, a bed, a table he'd built with his own two hands. He laid her on the bed, his bed, and piled wood on the fire until it roared to life. In the flickering light, he could see her more clearly. She was young, maybe 25, beautiful, with the kind of refined features that spoke of a life of education and comfort. But suffering had carved its own story onto her face. He heated water, his movements sure and efficient. Her dress was frozen to her skin in places. He worked carefully, his big hands surprisingly deft, cutting the fabric away. He tried not to look, tried to give her the dignity the world had clearly denied her. He dressed her in one of his own clean shirts. It swallowed her small frame, falling to her knees like a proper nightgown. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, but still she shivered. Those terrible deep tremors wouldn't stop. Tassa knew that cold. He'd seen it take strong men. He knew that sometimes the only thing that could fight it was the warmth of another living soul. He banked the fire high, stripped down to his union suit, and slid into the bed beside her. He pulled her back against his chest, his body a furnace against her ice. His arms wrapped around her, one hand instinctively splaying protectively over the swell of her belly. She was so cold, so terribly cold. But slowly, minute by agonizing minute, the heat from his body began to seep into hers. The violent shivers eased, replaced by smaller tremors. Her breathing, shallow and ragged before, began to deepen. And finally, as the wind howled its fury outside, she stirred. "No!" The word was a cracked, desperate whisper. "Please!" Her eyes flew open. They were brown, the color of rich summer earth, and they were wide with pure animal terror. She tried to pull away, but she was as weak as a newborn kitten. "Easy," Taza said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't move, didn't tighten his grip. He let her feel that he was a source of warmth, not a threat. "You're safe. You were near frozen. Found you in my barn." Confusion began to replace the fear in her eyes. Her hands, shaky and weak, moved to her belly in the timeless gesture of a mother. "The baby," she whispered. "Moving some," Taza said softly. "Felt it when I carried you in." Relief, so powerful it was almost a physical blow, washed over her face. Then just as quickly, exhaustion claimed her again. She was in a stranger's bed, wearing a stranger's clothes, with the stranger himself pressed against her. But she was warm. For the first time in what must have been days, she was warm. And in that moment, warmth was more important than fear. Her eyelids fluttered closed. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice barely disturbing the quiet of the cabin. "Eve," she breathed. "Ivana. Ivana Marston." The carpet bag, EM, it fit. "I'm Taza Redhawk," he said. "This is my place. You're safe here now." She made a small sound, a sigh that was part acknowledgement, part despair. Then sleep, deep and profound, finally took her. Taza lay awake for a long time, listening to the storm rage, feeling the small, fragile life he held in his arms. The questions circled in his mind like hungry wolves. Who was Ivana Marston? And what in God's name had driven a pregnant woman out into a killer blizzard, alone? The blizzard blew itself out over 3 long days. When the world outside finally fell silent, it was a world transformed, buried under a thick blanket of white. Evana had spent most of that time sleeping, the deep, healing sleep of someone who had been pushed past the limits of human endurance. Taza had fed her broth, kept the fire roaring, and watched as the color slowly returned to her cheeks. When she finally woke for good, the fear was back in her eyes, but it was a different kind of fear now. It wasn't the fear of freezing to death. It was the fear of what came next. I should go," she said, her voice still weak as she tried to sit up. "You should rest," Taza said firmly. He was sitting in his chair by the hearth, carving a piece of pine. "That snow's not going anywhere for a week, maybe more." She sank back into the pillows, but he could feel her trembling. He understood. A woman alone with a man who was not her husband. A white woman, alone with a man the world called a savage. The scandal would be enough to destroy her if she wasn't destroyed already. "I can sleep in the barn," she whispered. "I don't want to be a burden." "You'll freeze in the barn," he said, his voice flat. He got up and began to make coffee. "When was the last time you ate a real meal?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. He made cornmeal mush, thick and steaming, with a generous spoonful of molasses. She ate like a starving animal, trying to maintain some semblance of her former manners. But her hunger was a raw, desperate thing. He didn't press her with questions. He just refilled her bowl when it was empty. Finally, with warmth in her belly and the rich, dark coffee chasing away the last of the chill, she seemed to find her voice. "I suppose you're wondering, your business is your own," he said, but his eyes invited her to speak. In the clear light of day, she could see him properly for the first time. He was even larger than she'd realized, a mountain of a man who had to duck his head to move through his own home. His face was all harsh angles and proud lines, the legacy of his Apache father. But his eyes were deep and quiet, and in them she saw not savagery, but a profound and weary sadness. "My husband," she began, her voice gaining strength. "Thaddeus Marston. He died 3 months ago. Pneumonia." She paused, her hand resting on her belly. "It was only after he was gone that I discovered that I was with child. Thaddeus had debts," she continued, her gaze fixed on the fire. "Many debts. I didn't know. The bank took everything. The house on Maple Street, the business. They even took my mother's jewelry. They said I could work off what was owed, but—" her voice broke. "But no one would hire a pregnant widow." Taza could imagine the rest. He'd seen it before. The swift, brutal fall from grace. From respectable wife to charity case. From neighbor to burden. And on the frontier in the dead of winter, burdens were often cast aside to fend for themselves. "I heard there was work in Cheyenne," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I had just enough for a stage ticket. But the storm, the driver put me out at Cedar Ridge. Said it was too dangerous to go on." She gave a small, defeated shrug. "No one would take me in. A pregnant woman with no money. The hotel, the boarding house, even the church. Reverend Pike said they had to think of their reputation. I remembered seeing a barn from the road. His barn, 15 miles from town. Through a blizzard. It was a miracle she was alive. 'You can stay,' he said, the words simple and solid. 'Stay until the storm passes, until the roads are clear. Then we'll figure out what's to be done.'" Tears welled in her eyes, tears of gratitude and exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered. "I promise I won't be any trouble." As the day wore on, Taza found himself watching her. Her presence had changed the simple cabin. It felt less like a fortress he'd built against the world, and more like a home. A lonely home that had suddenly, impossibly, become a shelter for two souls the world had no use for. That evening, as she dozed by the fire, he picked up his piece of pine and his carving knife again. She woke to the soft, scraping sound of the blade on the wood. "What are you making?" she asked, her voice soft. "Toy," he said simply, not looking up. "For the little one." Her breath caught in her throat. Such a simple act of kindness. From a stranger. From a man her world had taught her to fear. It was too much. The tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally came. Silent and steady, carving clean paths down her dusty cheeks. Taza set aside his carving. He crossed the room and knelt by the bed. He didn't touch her. He just waited, a silent, solid presence, as she wept for her lost husband, her lost home, her lost life. When the sobs finally subsided, she looked at him, her eyes swollen and red. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you being so kind to me?" He was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers. Then, so softly she almost missed it, he said, "Know what it's like to have nowhere to go." In that single, shared glance, an understanding passed between them that was deeper than words. Two outcasts, two souls pushed to the very margins of society, finding an unexpected refuge in each other's company. The wind howled, a lonely, mournful sound. Taza rose and added another log to the fire. As he passed the bed, he paused, looking down at the woman who had blown into his life like a winter storm. "From now on," he said, the words coming from some deep, protected place inside him, "you're mine to protect." Another woman in another time might have bristled at the possessiveness of the words, but Ivana, alone and afraid, heard them for what they were. Not a claim of ownership, but a promise, a vow from one broken soul to another that she would not have to face the cold alone anymore. "Thank you," she whispered, and for the first time in a long, long time, she felt the faintest glimmer of something she had thought was lost forever. Hope. The thaw came slowly, but it came. The world outside the cabin window began to change, the brilliant, blinding white giving way to the rich, dark brown of the awakening earth. With each passing day, Ivana grew stronger. The hollows in her cheeks began to fill out, and the constant, weary sadness in her eyes was sometimes replaced by a flash of her old spirit. But with strength came the return of memory, and with memory came the sharp, stinging shame of her situation. She was living in a one-room cabin with a man who was not her husband, an Indian. The good ladies of Cedar Ridge would have fainted dead away. One morning, as they sat at the small table sharing coffee, she suddenly began to speak, the words pouring out of her as if a dam had broken. "I had a house once," she said, her voice tight, "on Maple Street, white, with green shutters. Thaddeus painted them himself the spring we were married." Taza listened, his face impassive, as she described her former life. The Wednesday afternoon teas with the church ladies, the charity drives she organized, the lemon cake she baked that was the talk of the town. "When Thaddeus got sick," she said, a bitter smile twisting her lips, "they came every day at first. They brought soup. They prayed. Good Christian women." The smile faded. "Then he died, and the creditors came. And suddenly those same women were too busy to visit. They started crossing the street when they saw me coming." She touched her belly. "When I began to show, it got worse, as if my baby was somehow tainted by his father's debts. Mrs. Morrison, a woman I'd known for 15 years, she told me I should go away. Give the child to a good family," she said. "Come back clean." Taza's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her purge the poison. "The hotel asked me to leave, the boarding house the same. Even Reverend Pike. He said the church couldn't be seen harboring a woman who might attract the wrong element." She laughed, a sharp, broken sound. The wrong element. As if poverty were a disease you could catch. She looked up at him then, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Do you know what it's like? To go from being someone to being no one? To watch people you've known your whole life look right through you as if you were made of glass?" "Yes," Taza said simply. The single word hung in the air between them, heavy with a history of its own. "Tell me," she whispered. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. He got up and went to the window, his broad back to her. "My mother was named Mary," he began, his voice low and measured. "A freed slave. She came west after the war, looking for a new life. She found my father instead. He was a young Apache warrior, wounded in a raid. She nursed him back to health." He shrugged, a gesture that spoke volumes. "I came along 9 months later. My father went back to his people before I was born. He had to. For them to stay together would have meant death for both of them. My mother understood. But the town didn't. A black woman with a half-breed baby? We might as well have painted targets on our backs." He stared out at the wide, empty plains. "She did washing, mending, anything she could to keep us fed. We lived in a shack on the edge of town. I was maybe 4 or 5 years old. We were walking to deliver laundry, and a group of boys. They threw rocks at us. They called her names. Terrible names. They called me worse." His hand clenched into a fist against the window frame. "She never let them see her cry. She always held her head high. She taught me to do the same. 'You're twice as strong as they are,' she'd say. 'You've got two people's blood in you. Don't you ever forget it.'" "What happened to her?" Ivana asked softly. "Fever," he said, his voice flat. "Took her when I was 7. The sheriff put me in the orphanage. I lasted 2 days. Then I ran." I lived wild for a while. The Apache found me, half dead one winter. They took me in, taught me to hunt, to track. But I was too white for them, just as I was too Indian for the town. I grew up between worlds, belonging to neither. I learned young that the only safety was in being alone. I built this place when I was 17. Been here ever since. He turned back to face her. 20 years of hearing them whisper, savage and half-breed. 20 years of watching mothers pull their children away as if I carried a plague. The silence in the cabin was profound. Two different stories, but the same ending. The slow, painful erosion of belonging. The terrible transformation from person to pariah. I was so proud, Ivana whispered, of my house, my position. I never thought about how fragile it all was. She looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. This giant of a man who had built a fortress of solitude to protect a gentle heart. "They're wrong about you," she said, her voice fierce. "The people in town, they're all wrong." He gave a small, weary shrug. "It doesn't matter if they're wrong. What matters is what they do about it." As if on cue, the sound of hoofbeats carried on the wind. Tassa stiffened, his body instantly on alert. He moved to the window. 3 riders, dark shapes against the melting snow, were making their way toward the cabin. "Get in the bed," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Pull the covers up high. Don't make a sound." Taza opened the door before they could knock, his massive frame filling the entire doorway. The lead rider was Sheriff Hayes, a man with a narrow face and eyes as cold as a winter sky. "Red Hawk," Hayes said, his voice sharp. "Heard you might have found something that belongs to the town." "A man finds a lot of things out here on the plains," Taza replied, his voice calm and even. "Not all of them belong to anyone." Hayes's cold eyes narrowed. "A woman went missing during the storm. A pregnant woman. Some folks seem to think she might have headed in this direction." "This is private land, Sheriff." "That it is. But harboring a runaway debtor is a crime, Red Hawk, even on private land." Hayes leaned forward in his saddle, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip. "She owes money to half the merchants in town. They want what's rightfully theirs." "Can't get blood from a stone, Sheriff." "Maybe not," Hayes said, a cruel smile touching his lips. "But there are those that say she could work it off after the baby comes. Plenty of establishments in Cheyenne would be willing to take her on." The ugly implication hung in the frigid air. "Of course," Hayes continued, his eyes scanning the cabin behind Taza. "That's assuming she's found in respectable circumstances. It would be a whole lot worse for her if she wasn't." Taza's hands clenched at his sides, but his voice remained steady. "The storm was bad. A lot of folks didn't make it through." Hayes stared at him, a silent battle of wills playing out between the two men. Finally, he gestured towards the barn. "Well, I suppose we should have a look in your barn, just to be thorough." "You got a warrant, Sheriff?" "Don't need one to look in a barn, Red Hawk." The tension stretched, thin and taut. Then one of the younger deputies shifted nervously in his saddle. "Sheriff, maybe we should head back. The snow's getting soft." Hayes didn't take his eyes off Tassa. "The boy's got a point. For now." He gathered his reins. "But I'll be back, Red Hawk, with papers if I have to. And if I find out you've been lying to me, well, aiding a fugitive is a serious offense. Might just be enough to finally run you off this land. Legally, of course." They wheeled their horses around and rode off, their dark shapes disappearing against the vast white landscape. Taza stood in the doorway until they were gone, then slowly closed the door, the heavy wooden bar sliding into place with a sound of finality. "They'll be back," Ivana said from the bed. Her voice was trembling. "I have to go. I've brought you nothing but trouble." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed. "Where would you go?" he asked gently. She had no answer. Her hand went to her belly, a reminder of how few choices she had left. "I could," she swallowed hard. "What the sheriff said about working it off, maybe—" "No." The word was sharp, cutting through the quiet of the cabin. "No," he said again, his voice softer this time. "That's not a life, not for you, not for the child." "Then what?" she cried, the desperation finally breaking through her carefully constructed composure. I can't stay here forever. They'll take this place from you. You're home. I won't be the reason you lose everything." He was quiet for a long time, staring down at his large, capable hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a strength that seemed to come from the very earth beneath him. "My mother used to say that dignity wasn't something other people could take from you. It was only something you could give away." He looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. "You've still got yours, Ivana. Don't you let them make you think otherwise." "Stay," he said, the word a quiet command. "Stay until the baby comes. After that, after that, we'll figure something out. But for now, you need to be safe. You need to be warm. I can give you that." "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk so much for me?" He stood and moved to the fire, his back to her. "Maybe because I know what it's like to have the world tell you, you're nothing," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Maybe because my mother would haunt my dreams if I turned away a woman in need." He paused, adding another log to the flames. "Or maybe it's because for the first time in 20 years, this place feels a little less empty." The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and beautiful. Evana watched the broad, strong line of his back, and she knew. This man, this outcast, had been shaped by solitude and rejection into something the world could not break. He offered her shelter not in spite of his own wounds, but because of them. "All right," she said softly. "Until the baby comes." He nodded without turning. "Until then." Outside, the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the snow-covered plains in shades of purple and gold. The world was still harsh, still filled with people who would see them as less than human. But inside the small, warm cabin, for the first time in a very long time, two broken people began the slow, cautious work of becoming whole. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as natural and comforting as a heartbeat. Taza would rise before the sun, his quiet movements a familiar start to Ivana's day. He would stoke the fire, put coffee on to boil, and by the time she stirred, the cabin would be filled with warmth and the rich, comforting aroma. She would find him at the table, mending a piece of harness or carving another small animal for the baby, his large hands surprisingly deft and patient with the delicate work. "I could help," she offered one morning, her hands feeling idle and useless. "I'm a good seamstress. Or I was." He glanced at her belly, which was growing more prominent with each passing day. "You're not idle," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "You're growing a person." "That doesn't mean I have to sit here like a porcelain doll," she retorted, a flash of her old spirit returning. She picked up one of his work shirts from the mending pile. "Good heavens, this thing has more patches than shirt. Let me at least earn my keep." He started to protest, but something in her eyes, the fierce need to contribute, to be more than just a burden, stopped him. He simply nodded towards an old sewing basket in the corner. They worked in a comfortable silence, the only sounds a soft whisper of her needle through the thick cloth and the rhythmic scrape of his knife against wood. Outside, the world was waking up. The sun lingered longer each day, and the steady drip, drip, drip of melting ice from the eaves was a constant, hopeful song. As the days turned into weeks, she learned the quiet patterns of his life. She learned how he spoke to his horses in a low, gentle voice as he brushed their coats in the morning. She learned how he stood at the window every evening, watching the sun set as if it were a sacred ritual. And sometimes in the deep quiet of the evening, he would pull out a small wooden flute and play melodies that were so filled with loneliness and beauty that they made her heart ache. "My father's people," he said when she asked about the music. "It's the only thing of theirs I have left." She learned practical things too, how to bank the fire so it would last through the night, how to read the sky for signs of changing weather, how to make a dozen different meals from cornmeal and dried beans. Skills she had never needed in her old life, but which felt more real, more vital than knowing which fork to use for fish. One afternoon, she felt a sudden, dramatic shift inside her. She gasped, her hand flying to her side. "What is it?" Taza asked, instantly alert. "Is it time?" "No," she breathed, a slow smile spreading across her face. "It's here." Without thinking, she reached out, took his large calloused hand, and placed it on her belly. Feel. Just then, the baby moved again, a slow, powerful roll that pushed firmly against Taza's palm. His face, usually so guarded and stoic, went completely still. His dark eyes widened with a look of pure, unadulterated wonder. "Strong little one," he murmured, his voice filled with awe. He kept his hand there, and she covered it with her own, unwilling to break the spell. In that moment, they were not a white woman and an Indian, not outcasts or pariahs. They were simply a man and a woman sharing in the universal miracle of a new life. The world outside their small cabin continued its slow, steady march toward spring. Ivena's body changed daily. Her back ached, her feet swelled, and she moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a ship coming into port. Taza noticed everything. He built her a new chair with better support for her back. He rubbed her aching feet in the evenings, his strong, gentle hands working magic on the swollen joints. "You don't have to do that," she protested weakly the first time. "My mother's feet swelled something terrible when she carried me," he said simply. "Least I can do." It was in these small, unspoken acts of tenderness that something began to shift between them. The careful, polite distance they had maintained began to dissolve, replaced by a comfortable intimacy that felt as natural as breathing. They talked for hours by the fire, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, their fears. He learned about her childhood in Ohio, and she learned about his years with the Apache, learning to live in harmony with the harsh, beautiful land. One morning she woke to find the door open and a wagon approaching on the horizon. Not the slow, plodding wagon of a traveler, but a wagon moving with purpose, flanked by 4 riders. Her heart leaped into her throat. Taza was already standing in the doorway, his rifle held loosely but ready in his hand. "Company," he said, his voice grim. "It's Hayes, and he's brought friends." "I'll make coffee," Ivana said, her voice shaking slightly as she tried to rise. "No," Taza said, his hand on her shoulder, gently pushing her back down. "You stay inside. Let me handle this. They're here for me, Taza. They're here because they think they've got rights they don't have," he said, his dark eyes meeting hers. "This is my land. You are under my protection. Remember that." The wagon pulled up in a cloud of dust. Sheriff Hayes dismounted, his cold eyes taking in the scene with a contemptuous sneer. The neat stack of firewood, the laundry line with Taza's mended shirts hanging beside her dress, the small vegetable garden they had started together. All the small domestic signs of a shared life. But it wasn't just Hayes this time. Seated rigidly in the wagon was Miriam Price, the self-appointed guardian of Cedar Ridge's morality, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. Beside her, looking nervous and uncomfortable, was Reverend Pike. "Red Hawk," Hayes said, dispensing with any pleasantries. "We've come for Mrs. Marston." "Don't see any Mrs. Marston here," Taza replied, his voice dangerously calm. "Don't play games with me," Hayes snapped. "Mrs. Price saw her through your window last week, living in sin with a savage. It's an abomination." Miriam Price screeched, her voice shrill. "The woman's got debts in town," Hayes said, pulling a piece of paper from his coat. "Judge Thornton has issued a warrant for her arrest, theft of services." "She didn't have a cent," Taza said, his voice still level, but his hands had curled into tight fists. "That's not our concern," Miriam Price interjected, her eyes glittering with righteous satisfaction. "There's a workhouse in Cheyenne that takes in fallen women. She can work off her debts there, and the child can be raised in proper Christian surroundings." The cabin door opened. Evana stepped out, her head held high. She had put on her one good dress, the blue wool, and her hair was pinned up neatly. Save for the proud swell of her belly, she looked every inch the respectable woman she had once been. "Mrs. Price," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Reverend, Sheriff, I see you've come to dispense your particular brand of Christian charity." "You're living with him, unmarried," Miriam shrieked, "carrying your husband's child while bedding down with a heathen." "I'm surviving," Ivana said simply, "which is more than any of you would have allowed me to do." She moved to stand beside Taza, a small, defiant figure next to his towering strength. "Mr. Red Hawk took me in when I was dying. He has fed me, sheltered me, and treated me with more respect and decency than any of you. If that is a sin, then I will answer for it gladly." "You'll answer for it now," Hayes said, stepping forward. "I have a warrant. You can come peacefully, or we can do this the hard way." Taza moved, placing himself squarely between Ivana and the sheriff. "She's not going anywhere." "Are you interfering with the law, Red Hawk?" "I'm standing on my own land," Taza said, his voice a low growl, "protecting a guest in my home." "This isn't just about the law," Miriam Price spat, her face twisted with a venom that had little to do with Christian values. "It's about the natural order of things. People in town are talking. They say you've bewitched her, used your Indian magic to cloud her mind." "The only magic here is common decency," Taza said quietly, "a concept you people seem to have forgotten." Hayes waved the warrant in his face. "This paper says she comes with us. You try to stop me and I'll arrest you too. And this land you're so proud of, you'll lose it. I'll see to it." The threat hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Ivana saw Taza tense beside her. She knew what this land meant to him. It was the only thing in the world that was truly his. "It's all right, Taza," she whispered, her hand on his arm. "I'll go." "No." He turned to her, and in his eyes she saw a fierce, protective fire that took her breath away. "You don't go with them, not like this." He faced Hayes again. "The warrant, it's for her debts." "How much?" Hayes blinked, caught off guard. "What? How much does she owe?" The sheriff fumbled with the paper. "Uh, $47.30. Without another word, Taza turned and strode into the cabin. He returned a moment later with a small leather pouch. He deliberately, carefully counted out a handful of coins and worn bills. $50, he said, thrusting the money at Hayes. "That covers it, with interest. The debt is paid." Hayes stared at the money in his hand, then at Miriam Price, whose face was turning a mottled shade of red. This doesn't change anything," she sputtered. "She's still living in sin. The whole town knows it." "Knowing and proving are two different things, Mrs. Price," Taza said, his voice as cold and hard as iron. "What you see," Ivana said, her own voice ringing with newfound strength, "is a woman keeping house for the man who saved her life. I am his hired help. There is nothing improper about that." "Hired help doesn't usually look at their employer with such devotion," Miriam sneered. "I look at him with gratitude and respect," Ivana retorted. "I'm sorry if those are foreign concepts to you." She placed a protective hand on her belly. "Now, unless you have legal grounds to remove me from my place of employment, I will ask you to leave. The stress is not good for the baby." Something in her tone, a quiet dignity mixed with unyielding steel, seemed to take the wind out of their sails. Even Miriam Price seemed momentarily silenced. Hayes, with no legal leg left to stand on, reluctantly pocketed the money. "This isn't over, Red Hawk," he said, his voice filled with menace. "We'll be watching you. Watch all you like," Taza said calmly. "Just do it from off my land." They turned and left, their righteous crusade ending not with a bang, but with a whimper. As soon as they were gone, Ivana's knees gave out. Taza caught her, lifting her as if she weighed nothing, and carried her back inside. $50, she whispered, her head against his chest. "Taza, that's a fortune." "It's nothing," he murmured, settling her into the chair he had made for her. "It's not nothing. It's months of work, years of saving." He knelt before her, taking her small hands in his large ones. "It's nothing," he said again, his dark eyes intense, "compared to having you here, to knowing you're safe." In that moment, looking into the face of this man who had just spent a fortune to protect her, who had stood against the hatred of an entire town for her sake, Ivana knew. This was more than gratitude. This was more than friendship. This was something deeper, something truer, something she had never known before. "They'll be back," she said softly. "Miriam won't let this go." "Let her try," he said, his thumbs gently stroking the backs of her hands. "For 20 years I've lived out here, keeping my head down, trying not to give them a reason. But some things are worth fighting for." "Am I?" she whispered, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Am I worth it?" He looked at her then, a long, searching look that saw past the swollen belly, past the tired face, to the fierce, resilient woman beneath. The woman who had learned to mend his shirts and split firewood. The woman who hummed his people's songs while she cooked. The woman who had brought laughter and light back into his dark, silent world. Yes, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. You are. The peace that followed was fragile, an uneasy truce. Taza and Ivana went about their days, but there was a new tension in the air. Taza was always watchful, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. They'll be back, he said one evening as they sat by the fire. The question is when and how. Ivana, now heavy and uncomfortable in the final weeks of her pregnancy, rubbed her aching back. Why do they hate us so much, Taza? What harm does our life here do to them? You broke their rules, he said, his eyes on the flames. A respectable woman is supposed to accept her shame, to disappear. You didn't. And worse, you found something better than what you lost. You found happiness with me. He looked at her then, his gaze intense. That threatens them. If a ruined woman can find happiness with an Apache, then maybe all the rules they live by, all the judgments they make, maybe they're meaningless. So they have to prove you're miserable, or make you that way. You could still leave, he said quietly, the words costing him more than she could ever know. Before the baby comes, I have some money left. I could get you to California, somewhere no one knows you. She stared at him, her heart aching at the pain in his eyes. Is that what you want? For me to go? I want you to be safe, he said, his voice rough. This trouble is just beginning. It's going to get worse. Don't, she said, struggling to her feet and crossing to him. She cupped his rugged face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. Don't you dare try to send me away for my own good. I have had enough of men deciding what's best for me. I am staying. By choice. My choice. Because this is where I want to be. With you. He pulled her close then, his arms wrapping around her protectively, and she felt him tremble. This mountain of a man, undone by her simple declaration. I never thought, he murmured into her hair, that anyone would choose to stand with me. Then you thought wrong, she whispered, pulling back to look at him. I choose you, Taza Redhawk. Today, tomorrow, and whatever comes after. I choose you. 3 days later, the storm they had been waiting for finally broke. But it wasn't a storm of wind and snow. Ivana woke in the pre-dawn darkness to a low, insistent pain that wrapped around her like a tight band. Taza, she gasped, her hand finding his in the dark. I think it's time. He was instantly awake, lighting the lamp, his face a mixture of awe and terror. He had prepared for this. Clean cloths were stacked, water was ready, but this was a battle he could not fight for her. As the hours passed, the pains grew stronger, more intense, coming in relentless waves that stole her breath and left her gasping. My mother, he said during a brief lull, his voice a comforting rumble in the tense quiet of the cabin. Said I was a stubborn baby. Took her 2 days to bring me into the world. But she said when I finally came, it was like the sun rising after the longest night, worth every moment of the pain. The day wore on, a blur of agony and exhaustion. Taza never left her side. He wiped her brow with cool cloths, held her hand, and murmured words of encouragement. As darkness fell again, the pain changed, becoming more urgent, more focused. I need to push, she gasped, her body taken over by a force more powerful than she could have imagined. What followed was a primal, desperate struggle. Ivana bore down with a strength she didn't know she possessed, her cries mingling with the sound of the wind howling outside. Taza was there, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of pain, ready to catch the new life fighting its way into the world. I can see the head, he said, his voice filled with a wondering joy. Come on, Ivana, you can do it. And then, with one final monumental effort, the pressure was gone. A thin, fierce cry pierced the air, a sound more beautiful than any music. It's a boy, Taza said, his voice thick with emotion as he gently placed the tiny, wailing baby on her chest. A perfect, beautiful boy. Evana looked down at the small, miraculous creature, and her heart cracked wide open. "Hello," she whispered, her fingers trembling as she touched his soft cheek. "Oh, hello, my brave one." They named him Sky, for the endless Wyoming sky that had witnessed their unlikely love story, and for the Apache grandfather he would never know. They sat in the quiet aftermath, the three of them, a small, perfect family forged in the heart of a storm. They were so lost in their own world that they didn't hear the riders until they were right outside the cabin. A sharp, brutal knock shattered the peace. "Sheriff Hayes, open up, Red Hawk. We know you're in there." Taza was on his feet in an instant, the rifle in his hands. "Someone must have been watching the cabin," he said grimly. "Woman just gave birth." He called through the door. "Come back tomorrow." "Can't do that," Hayes's voice replied, cold and hard. "We've had reports of screaming, sounds of distress. We need to check on Mrs. Marston's welfare." Taza looked at Ivana, pale and exhausted in the bed, the newborn clutched to her chest. "Let them in," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Let them see. I am not ashamed." He unbarred the door. Hayes strode in, followed by two deputies and, inevitably, Miriam Price. Her eyes went straight to the bed, her face a mask of horrified fascination. "Dear Lord," she breathed, "it's true. You actually had the baby. With him." "Yes, Mrs. Price," Ivana said, her voice dripping with irony. "Women do that sometimes." "With no doctor? No proper Christian woman to attend you?" Miriam's voice rose to a shrill pitch. "No one else offered," Taza said evenly. "We've had complaints," Hayes said, clearing his throat. "Says you're holding Mrs. Marston against her will, that you might have influenced the birth with your savage ways." "Influenced?" Ivana would have laughed if she wasn't so tired. "He saved us. I would have died without him. My baby would have died." "Stop," she said, her voice cutting through Miriam's venomous tirade like a knife. "I have just brought a new life into this world. My son is hours old. And you come into my home, our home, with your poison and your hate. Have you no decency at all?" She struggled to sit up, ignoring the pain. "You want to know what happened here? A man showed kindness and compassion. A man helped a woman in need. He showed more humanity than any of you have ever known." She looked directly at the sheriff. "I am here by choice. I stay by choice. My son was born into love and safety. Now get out." "Our home?" Hayes seized on the words. "So you're admitting to this arrangement?" "I'm admitting to being alive," Ivana shot back. "And if that's a crime, then arrest me. But I think even Judge Thornton might think twice about jailing a woman who's just given birth." The men shifted uncomfortably. In the tense silence, Sky began to cry, his small, hungry wails filling the cabin. "My son needs to be fed," Ivana said, her voice softening as she looked down at the baby. "So unless you plan on watching that too, I suggest you leave." Hayes looked from the defiant woman in the bed to the fiercely protective man standing beside her. Whatever he had expected to find, it wasn't this. Not a helpless victim, but a proud mother. Not a squalid den of sin, but a home. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. They filed out, their righteous anger deflated by the simple, undeniable reality of the scene they had just witnessed. As the door closed behind them, Ivana sagged back against the pillows, her strength finally failing her. "They'll keep coming back," she whispered. "Let them," Taza said, his hand gentle on Sky's downy head. "We have what matters." "Yes," she murmured, her eyes drifting closed. "We do." Outside, the world was still cold and unforgiving. But inside the small cabin, a family had been born, and they were ready to fight for it. The next storm came a week later, and it was a storm of a different kind. It began with a frantic pounding on the door in the middle of the night. Taza grabbed the rifle, his heart pounding. "Who's there?" "It's Doc Morrison. I need help. A woman's dying." Taza cautiously opened the door. The town doctor stumbled in, his face pale and desperate. Behind him, two men were half carrying a young woman, her dress soaked with blood. "It's Sarah Patterson," the doctor gasped, his eyes finding Ivana. "The baby's coming wrong. I can't stop the bleeding. I need another pair of hands." Skilled hands. Ivana recognized one of the men. It was Mr. Patterson, the banker, the man who had foreclosed on her home. His face was a mask of desperation and disgust. We can't bring her in here, he stammered. You want your daughter to die? The doctor snapped. Because that's what's going to happen if we don't act now. Mrs. Marston knows more about birthing than any woman in this town. Now, are you going to help me save her, or are you going to let your pride kill her? Without a word, Ivana was out of bed. Bring her here, she commanded, her voice calm and authoritative. Taza, we need hot water. Lots of it. What followed was a desperate, bloody battle for 2 lives. The small cabin was transformed into a makeshift infirmary. Ivana worked alongside the doctor, her hands sure and steady, her voice a constant source of encouragement for the terrified young woman on the bed. Mr. Patterson and Sarah's young husband huddled by the door, watching in horrified silence as their clean, orderly world collided with the raw, brutal reality of life and death. Sarah screamed, her strength failing. I can't do it. Yes, you can, Ivana said, her voice fierce. You are stronger than you know. All women are. Now you listen to me, and you push. Just then, from his cradle in the corner, Sky began to cry. The sound of his healthy wail seemed to galvanize Sarah. She bore down with a renewed, desperate strength. I can feel it, the doctor said. She's coming. With a final heroic effort from Sarah and the skilled guidance of Ivana and the doctor, the baby slid into the world. A tiny girl, but she was blue and silent. She's not breathing, the doctor said, his voice filled with despair. But Ivana was already moving. She snatched up the tiny, limp body and began to work, her actions driven by pure instinct. She cleared the baby's mouth, rubbed the small chest, and breathed her own air into the tiny, unresponsive lungs. Come on, she whispered, her voice a desperate prayer. Come on, little fighter. Breathe. The seconds stretched into an eternity. And then, a cough, a sputter, and a thin, reedy wail that was the most beautiful sound in the world. Ivana, her face streaked with tears and sweat, placed the crying baby on Sarah's chest. There she is, she said softly. There's your daughter. The doctor stared at her, his face filled with a new and profound respect. Where did you learn to do that? You learn what you have to, Ivana said simply, to survive. As dawn broke, the storm outside had passed. Inside the cabin, an even greater storm had been weathered. Sarah and her baby girl were sleeping peacefully, both alive, both safe. Mr. Patterson, the proud, rigid banker, sat at Taz's table, his face buried in his hands, weeping with relief and gratitude. She would have died, he said, his voice hollow. They both would have died if not for you. Life is precious, Ivana said, rocking Sky in her arms. Every life. When they were ready to leave, Patterson approached her, his eyes filled with a shame he couldn't hide. The debt, he said, his voice thick. Your husband's debt to my bank. I'll mark it paid in full. Taza already paid it, she reminded him gently. Then I will return his money. With interest. It's the least I can do. The least you can do, she said, her voice firm but not unkind, is remember this. Remember that we are people. Just people. Before she left, Sarah grasped Ivana's hand. Thank you, she whispered, her eyes shining with tears. We're going to name her Grace, because that's what you showed us. As they watched the small party make their way back towards town, Taza put his arm around Ivana. You're a remarkable woman, Ivana Marston, he said quietly. She leaned her head against his shoulder, exhausted but filled with a strange, fierce joy. Do you think, she asked, that this will change anything? It already has, he said. That little girl is alive because you didn't let their hate stop you from helping. That's how the world changes, Ivana. Not all at once, but one life at a time, one act of grace at a time. The final confrontation came when Sky was a month old. A posse of 10 men, led by Sheriff Hayes, rode up to the cabin. But this time they were not alone. With them was Judge Thornton, his face as hard and unyielding as the Wyoming landscape. Red Hawk! Marston! The judge's voice boomed. This ends today. Taza and Ivana stepped out of the cabin. Sky held tight in Ivana's arms. I have here, the judge said, waving a document, An order issued under the Territorial Moral Standards Act. It gives me the authority to remove a child from any environment deemed corrupting. The child comes with us, Mrs. Marston. You will return to town and submit to the authority of the church, or you will lose him. The choice is yours. You can't, Ivana whispered, her blood running cold. I can, the judge said, his voice devoid of any emotion, and I will. Over my dead body, Taza said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. That can be arranged, Hayes said, his hand moving to his pistol. Stop. Ivana's voice rang out, sharp and clear. You want me to choose? Between my child and the man I love? Between your law and my life? Just then, a wagon appeared on the road from town. It was Doc Morrison, and beside him sat Sarah Patterson, holding her baby, Grace. Riding alongside them were Sarah's husband, and incredibly, Mr. Patterson himself. Judge Thornton! The banker's voice boomed, filled with an authority that had nothing to do with the law. What is the meaning of this? This doesn't concern you, Patterson, the judge snapped. It concerns me, Patterson said, dismounting and moving to stand between the posse and the cabin. When you threatened the woman who saved my daughter and my granddaughter's life. Sarah was next, her voice weak but clear. Mrs. Marston showed me what real courage is. If you take her baby, you'll have to take mine too. Because I will not raise my daughter in a world where such cruelty is called justice. The judge was stunned into silence. His carefully constructed legal authority was crumbling before his eyes, replaced by the simple, powerful truth of human connection. From the back of the posse, another figure emerged. It was Reverend Pike. I have prayed on this, Judge, the minister said, his voice filled with a newfound conviction. And I find no sin here. I see only a family forged in love and hardship. Judge not, lest ye be judged. I have done too much judging in my life. It stops today. The posse began to mutter amongst themselves. The clear lines of right and wrong, of us and them, had been hopelessly blurred. This wasn't a righteous crusade anymore. It was an attack on a family, on their neighbors, on people who had shown them nothing but grace. This isn't over, Thornton snarled, but his words were empty. He wheeled his horse around and rode away, the remnants of his posse trailing behind him like a defeated army. In the aftermath, an unlikely community gathered in the small cabin. The banker, the doctor, the minister, the young couple, the outcast Apache, and the fallen woman. Former enemies now bound together by a shared moment of grace. That night, as spring rain fell gently on the roof, Tassa and Ivana lay together, Sky sleeping peacefully between them. We did it, she whispered in the darkness. We survived. More than survived, Taza corrected, his voice filled with a love that was as vast and deep as the Wyoming sky. We lived, and we showed them what living really means. In the days and weeks that followed, the world began to change. The cabin on the plains, once a symbol of isolation and fear, became a beacon of hope. Travelers on the westward trail began to stop there, hearing tales of the giant Apache and the brave woman who had faced down a town's hatred and won. One day, Judge Thornton rode out to the cabin alone. I've come, he said, his voice stiff and awkward, to apologize. My own grandson took a fever. Doc Morrison was away. Sarah Patterson came. She saved him. She said she learned how from you. He looked up, and in his stern eyes they saw something new. I was wrong, he said simply, about everything. The cabin that had once been a lonely refuge was now a home, a true home, filled with the sounds of laughter and the promise of a future they had built with their own two hands. They were not bound by law or by blood, but by something far stronger. They were bound by choice, by courage, and by a love that had refused to be broken. They had faced the worst of the world and had answered it with the best of themselves. And in doing so, they had not just saved themselves, they had saved everyone. If you enjoyed this story of love and courage on the American frontier, please let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. We love connecting with our listeners from all around the world. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales of the Wild West, where heroes are forged in the fires of adversity and love is the most powerful force of all.